It's time for the Josh Kirby on Sports Podcast.
On this edition of the Kirby on Sports Podcast, that's right, football is near to return. We will have a preview on what is to come on the Kirby on Sports Podcast this NFL football season. All that and so much more. But before we begin, we would like to thank our brand new sponsor at Regroup Building Services, specializing in custom homes, remodels, additions, and so much more. If you're looking for a new place to call home or just need repairs on your current home, look no further. Regroup Building Services has you covered. Make sure you check them out today at www.regroupbuildingservices.com. Once again, that's regroupbuildingservices.com. We do the honeydews that your honey don't. Make sure you tell them Josh sent you. We are also sponsored by PM Plus Reserves, now expanding their territory to serve the I-81 corridor from Hagerstown, Maryland to Stanton, Virginia. All right. It's time for another edition of the Kirby on Sports Podcast, starting right now.
I'm glad you connected. This is Dave Johnson, voice of the Washington Wizards. You have connected to the right place because you are listening to my man, Josh Kirby, on Sports Podcast.
All right, welcoming you back to another edition of the Kirby on Sports Podcast. Sort of a NFL preview, a quick preview. I know with COVID and everything, it's been really nuts. I still cannot believe that the NFL is only a couple days away. I mean, in my opinion, it's sort of like I have to see it before I believe it, because with COVID, who knows what's going on? So, joining me to talk about the new Washington football team, some stuff around the NFC East and beyond, giving us a look at what is ahead this football season. My man, Pete Hailey from NBC Sports Washington. He's a personality there. He is a co-host on the Washington Football Talk podcast. So, Pete, want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to be with us. First off, I ask pretty much everybody who calls into my show this. Has your job been affected? And if so, how has your job been affected by COVID? And are you and your family staying safe so far?
Very nice first question you to ask. Yes, family is safe. I'm safe. And I'm thankful to still have a job. I know that hasn't been true for a lot of people during these times, so I try to keep that perspective. The job has definitely changed, of course. We're interviewing people on a computer instead of in face-to-face, and not in the office. Haven't been in the office in 8 months or so, and kind of miss it, honestly. Miss all the awkward small talk that I previously hated, just because it's such a normal part of your routine that you start to really long for after a while. So, I mean, I could bore you for 20 more minutes about all the little details, but of course the job has changed, but I still like having it, and I'm looking forward for the season to resume, because that will be the most regular things have been in a long time for us.
Obviously, some challenges for you, Pete, with COVID. Like you mentioned, the Zoom press conferences, the limited access in practice. You actually just came from practice. So can you tell us how that sort of affects what you do? And is it harder for you to get a story out there, or is it about the same? What is that like for you?
To the outside, it may not seem like the access is that different. I mean, we can still hang out on the sideline, take the same videos we've always been able to. We still see the same amount of practice we've always been able to see. But some of the stories just won't be as good because you won't be able to talk to as many guys as you want. So if I want to write a story about Dwayne Haskins being the starter, I can take the stuff that Ron Rivera told us on Zoom a couple days ago and what Scott Turner said on Zoom. But beyond that, I can't walk around the locker room and ask a random question of Steven Sims or Logan Thomas or make little observations about how Dwayne is interacting with guys in the locker room. So the stories and stuff will continue to churn out, and it will feel probably the same for most fans, but there's just little details that you miss by not getting that access. You don't see as many behind-the-scenes stuff. So that's understandable. The stories will still be coming out to fans. They'll still be able to read them, but I just don't think they'll be as good, at least in my opinion.
Absolutely. I love what you said there. So, the Washington football team, as you know, from the controversial name change to the allegations mentioned in the Washington Post, since being there covering the team this season, your former coworker Julie Donaldson takes a role with the front office, the senior VP of media. I'm not sure exactly what that title is, but from what you have seen, Pete, are the Washington football team and the organization looking for long-term change? And have you seen that change recently over the past couple of months?
Yeah, football-wise, you definitely see the change. The practices are really intense, and it's easy to kind of just compare them to what Jay Gruden did earlier and just point out everything and kind of over-assume and make grand assumptions about the way they're different. But I think there is some true differences. The hitting has really been ratcheted up, and I think that's a direct result of Ron Rivera's hire. I think there's a lot more tempo. There's a lot more emphasis on details. And then he had a good quote last week. Somebody asked him if he can see off the field how his culture is developing. And he said, yeah, and this may seem corny to some of your listeners, but I kind of buy in. I like corny stuff sometimes. And he said, yeah, you can tell the culture's changing when I go into the locker room and I see players picking up garbage and throwing in the trash can. They're taking ownership of their locker room. And that little thing, I think, speaks to just the guys are paying more attention to everything that's around them. So Ron, I think, is going to just have a tremendous impact. Every fan should be really thankful that he's leading the way. And then, of course, Julie's arrival and Jason Wright's arrival. You're just getting different voices, different people in there. And after 2 decades of disastrous performance, the more change, the better, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So, your thoughts on what you've seen so far as a whole? Do you have any predictions on what how the season will turn out based on what you have seen from the Washington football team so far?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. I mean, I think early on they will be able to surprise some folks. I think the fact that there hasn't been any preseason will allow players like Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissick and Steven Sims, all these dudes who are just in constant motion. I think defenses will have a hard time adjusting to that. This is going to be a very different looking offense from Washington than opponents like the Eagles and Cowboys and Giants are used to seeing. So maybe that first month you might see some surprising performances, some surprising scores. But unfortunately, I think it will even out in the end. I think the defense I feel better about after being in camp, but I feel a little bit worse about the offense. The offensive line is very sketchy. Jaron Christian, I'm proud of him for seizing the opportunity at left tackle, but he's still pretty unproven. Left guard, Ron Rivera was still tinkering with it as of a couple days ago. I think he's pretty nervous about interior protection on the left side. Receivers, Antonio Gandy-Golden didn't really surface like I hoped he would, and Dontrell Inman's fine, but I don't think anybody wants Dontrell Inman to be as involved as he's going to be for Washington. So early on, I think there'll be some surprising success, but later on, if they're going to sustain that, it's going to have to be led by the defense, which I think is stacked, but I don't know if they're going to be stacked enough to overcome an offense that may just not score enough points consistently.
So has the team, this isn't just a question about the Washington football team, but the league in general, has there been changes that you have seen to the roster and stuff due to there being no preseason games? They're just hopping straight into the regular season. How is the roster going to work? Will there be cuts throughout the regular season like we have seen? in the preseason, or how do you think that is going to affect roster management and stuff like that?
One way is that veterans will probably get the nod more in these close position battles. That's something Ron told us, and I think that's something coaches will take into account in every battle they're looking at. Just because without preseason, you may feel good about a rookie, but you may not feel good enough about that rookie to take him over the seventh-year guy who is proven with his track record and who you can count on. So look for more veteran-laden rosters across the league, and then during the season, I know there's some different practice squad rules. We're still trying to nail down exactly what those are, but you can put some veterans on your practice squad. It doesn't just have to be rookies or guys with limited experience. So that will allow teams to bring guys up if injuries or corona things happen, where they can bring up older guys and maybe not miss as much, not skip a beat as much. But yeah, it's going to be weird. The practice squads are expanded. Rosters are a little bit different on game day. You can use an extra lineman. Sort of like you could use an emergency quarterback back in the day. So little changes here and there, but a large part, I think it's going to resemble the football that we're used to seeing over the past 20, 30, 50 years, that it hasn't had to deal with a virus like this season will have to deal with.
Pete Hailey joining us on the Kirby on Sports podcast. Pete, next question here for you. The league has implemented that the individual teams set the rules on attendance guidelines and stuff. Washington has opted to play in an empty stadium as compared to other teams. Do you think that just has to do with the demographic and how much COVID has been spread in that area? Or do you think it's just because they don't want to host fans? Or what are your thoughts on that?
We haven't gotten a real straight answer on that. I think that's just a lot of Hogan and Maryland's decision-making kind of bleeding into the Washington football team. I don't know how much say they really had in that discussion, but one thing I will say is while they put out the release, they said we have no fans for the season. That's always something you can walk back if things change. And, of course, so many things are changing day to day with this virus, and projections and cures and vaccines. So maybe come week 8 or come week 10, they'll be able to get 10,000, 15,000 people into the stadium like some of the other teams are doing. So that's one thing I'm holding out hope for. I know fans would love to be at the stadium. I know it would add something. One thing I'm kind of thinking about is I think the NFL will be pretty different without fans. I think you see in some sports it's been okay. Like the NBA I've been watching and I've been enjoying it. But baseball, I'm just not as hooked as I would be. That silence can really throw you off as a viewer. So, I mean, imagine a Dwayne Haskins clutch touchdown to Terry McLaurin in the third quarter, 40-yarder, and there's no roar. There's no explosion. I think that's going to impact the product. So for Washington, I hope they can get fans in, and I think you'll see a pretty marked difference when you're watching games with fans versus without. I know we'll be happy for football regardless, but watch for that. Maybe your listeners can kind of ask themselves if it's impacting the product for them overall.
Absolutely, Pete. So let's go around the league just really quick. I know you don't have a lot of time, but we have two big changes, in my opinion. Cam Newton going to the Patriots and Tom Brady going to the NFC in Tampa Bay. Let me get your thoughts on those two quarterback moves and how those teams are, in your opinion, they might do this season.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the Bucs. I don't want to doubt Brady, but 43, changing scenery for the first time in a couple decades, a little bit on the decline. I know they're surrounding him with so much talent, and if someone can do something with that talent, it's going to be Tom Brady. But I'm just not sure Gronk's going to be able to hold up. Leonard Fournette's a good running back. I don't think he's a top-flight running back. But, yes, those two receivers in Edmonds and Godwin are probably the best duo in the league. So I think the Bucs will make the playoffs, but I probably have them lower in terms of Super Bowl contenders than a lot of people do. And then as for Newton up north, I'm incredibly intrigued by that. I think he's very motivated. I can't believe they got him for the deal they did. We could look back on that in 4 months and say, really, that might be the most ultimate bargain that's ever been signed in the NFL. I think he's going to be very motivated. I think Bill is going to have a fun time adjusting. I think Bill's going to be motivated to show people he can win without Tom. So I think those two teaming up could be a pretty evil combination. So I'm higher on the Patriots than most, I think, and I'm probably a tad lower on the Bucks than most people would be. But I think the Bucks will easily make the playoffs and have their say in, the divisional round. I just don't know if they're going to be Super Bowl bound with Tom's aging and having to get used to a whole new surroundings.
Absolutely. So, Earl Thomas a couple weeks ago from the Ravens gets released after a fight during practice. I heard some rumors that he might be the front runner to go to Dallas. Has that happened? Have you heard any more about if Thomas is going to Dallas or anywhere else around the league?
I haven't heard too much about Earl, and that release was pretty shocking. I guess now some stories have come out where that clearly wasn't his only offense. He was kind of a nuisance when it came to meetings. I mean, nobody likes waiting for that dude to show up. No one likes that last guy at the meeting who's making everybody sit around, and apparently that wore pretty thin on a lot of Ravens players. And good for John Harbaugh for taking a stand and siding with the majority and saying, look, this guy's talented, but if you want him out, I'll get rid of him. I think that's going to earn him even more trust in that locker room. So that move to me was sudden, but like I said, it had been building for a while, so the Ravens will try and be better off without him. And Earl, I'm a little bit surprised he hasn't been plucked yet by some team, but maybe everybody's just kind of waiting to cut down, see what they have in their defensive backfield. I'm sure he's going to end up somewhere soon. He's too talented to not be somewhere, but he is aging. He is a box safety, and those guys are a little bit falling out of fashion just because you have to have so much speed and so much coverage ability. But Earl Thomas will end up somewhere. He'll improve a defense. That's my hot take for you. It's not very interesting, but it's all I got.
Absolutely. Anything you can give us is great, Pete. The Chargers moving over to the AFC has named Tyrod Taylor the starter after a couple years of sitting out. Do you think this is a good move for the Chargers having Tyrod back as QB1?
I mean, it's as good as a move as it can get with Tyrod Taylor. I mean, he's a fine starter, but this just reeks me of somebody who will be out by mid-October probably, and they'll turn to Herbert. But if Herbert wasn't earning it the way Anthony Lynn wanted or wasn't showing enough, then there's nothing wrong with going with the veteran and trying that out. But this kind of reeks like a Case Keenum situation where maybe the rookie wasn't ready, so you go to the veteran who you can count on, and he throws for a couple hundred yards a game and 2 touchdowns or 2 picks, and eventually you kind of get tired of the in the middle performances that he'll probably turn out, and you go with Herbert to start his development. But it's a fine move. I don't think the Chargers made any missteps there.
Any players you saw in the draft that you're looking forward to watching? Any players you think that are going to have a breakout season this year?
I think the easy selection for that question is Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Kansas City. There's no other real running back to take snaps away from him. The skill set should fit in absolutely perfectly with what Andy Reid wants to do. And when you're a running back paired with Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, and Patrick Mahomes, you're going to have a lot of open space to work with, especially when you can catch the ball like him. So I think he's going to be an absolute stud, get a ton of touches early, and just be an immediate impact player. I got him as Offensive Rookie of the Year. I got him as a Pro Bowler. I think he's going to just be a superstar. So it's no wonder the Chiefs made the trade up late in the first round to go back and get him. I think they're going to reap the benefits of that move basically starting right away.
All right, Pete, any bold predictions on who you think will make it to the playoffs? Anything that comes to your mind, bold predictions about any teams that you think could have a shot to make it to the playoffs this year?
Maybe the Lions in the NFC North. The Packers always going to be competitive with Aaron Rodgers, but it's weird how they're building their team around him. And of course, he's getting older too. Maybe he's a little discontented with his situation. Maybe that program fails a little bit. The Vikings, of course, with Kirk, but a lot of talent there. Sometimes it doesn't come together. Mike Zimmer and Kirk Cousins, do they continue to butt heads? Does Adam Thielen get annoyed? You lose Stephon Diggs. And then the Bears, it's Trubisky or Foles. I'm not worried too much about them. So the Lions going worst to first in that division. I feel okay with that. I think that might be my surprise NFC team. And then the AFC seems kind of cut and dry. I know everybody's high on the Bills in the AFC East now that Tom is in the NFC, but I still think the Patriots will keep their grips on that division just because of Cam Newton's performance. So maybe the Patriots is a surprise because everybody's leaning so heavily towards the Bills. But it also feels weird to call the Patriots a surprise when they've been the most dominant franchise in sports for 10, 15 seasons already.
Last but not least, Peter Hailey of NBC Sports Washington on the Kirby on Sports podcast. I totally forgot to mention this. Dwayne Haskins gets the nod for Washington as QB1 for week 1, but the incredible comeback of Alex Smith. You were there when he got injured. You were there through his entire journey, and he has been officially cleared to play football. How was that journey in your eyes from the media's perspective? Like, it was a remarkable comeback. Like, he had like 12 something surgeries and after he broke his leg against the Texans. What are your thoughts about that journey and the mentality of Alex Smith? Is he ready to get back out there, or what are his thoughts on that?
Yeah, you said remarkable. You can just search synonyms for remarkable and list off the next 20 that you read. I mean, every word that you can think of applies to this comeback. He's the most jaw-dropping, inspiring guy that you can find in sports. I think his impact on that locker room has just been so huge. We talked to Nick Sundberg about it on our podcast a couple of days ago, and when you have a little bit of a nick on your hamstring or your knee hurts a little bit and you look over and see Alex Smith is back on the field, and how can you sit out? How can you feel like you need to take a day off? So everything he's done up to this point has been super earned, super deserved. Every accolade he gets in the future, every compliment he gets, he should absolutely get. Comeback Player of the Year award, those things should be his. I don't know if he's going to really factor in on the field, though. They're still a little bit concerned about how he'll be able to protect himself, of course. Up to this day, he still hasn't taken any 11-on-11 contact snaps. That's the next step in the comeback, and it's going to be interesting to see if he really is on the roster. They can maybe try and put him on IR, have him come back later in the year, let him continue to work his way back. But cutting him could be difficult because he's due $20 million either way. Maybe they just want to have him on the roster so they feel like they're paying that money for something. But Alex Smith is already a winner in my eyes. I know he wants to complete the comeback by taking a snap, and I hope he gets that opportunity. I don't know when or where that opportunity comes, but I do hope he gets it because it would be the last step on this journey that I can't believe he's so far into, and he deserves to completely finish in the future.
Do you think Alex Smith could serve as a leader or a mentor to the young quarterbacks in the system, as in Haskins and Kyle Allen from Carolina?
Yeah, 10 billion% he could. It's what he's done in San Francisco. It's what he's done in Kansas City, and it's what he's done for Dwayne Haskins so far. Dwayne is not hesitant to talk about the impact that Alex has on him, how many things he's already learned about, even from just, hey, here's the days that you lift hard. Here's how you manage your arm. Here are the things you look for when you study. Here are the best times to study. Here's when you get to the facility to study before practice and when you should leave and the guy's stuff. I mean, every little tip he can give, he's passed on to Dwayne. So he can absolutely be a mentor, and I think that is one of the reasons he's such an attractive guy to have on the roster, even if he may not be your backup, even if he is your third quarterback. The things he can teach, the culture he can spread just from being such a revered person. It's a very useful guy to have around. He would make every single person, player, coach, secretary better just by letting his influence spread around that building.
Absolutely, Pete. Great insight from you. You can find Pete on Twitter at Pete Hailey. He's also part of the Washington Football Talk podcast with JP Finley and Mitch Tisler. Pete, enjoy the season, sir. Thanks for hopping on with us, and continue to stay safe during these challenging times, sir.
Thank you, Josh. I'm glad we finally made it work, and it was my pleasure. I appreciate the support, and I'm glad I could make an appearance on your pod.
Absolutely. Kirby on Sports will continue right after this. All right, big thanks to Pete Hailey of NBC Sports Washington for taking the time to be with us. Great insights as always. We do apologize if there were some technical difficulties on the phone call. Post-production magic isn't always the best, but, once again, welcoming you to another edition of the Kirby on Sports podcast. We're pleased to be sponsored by Regroup Building Services. where we do the honeydews that your honey don't, and by PM Plus Reserves, now expanding their territory to serve the I-81 corridor between Hagerstown, Maryland, and Stanton, Virginia. A little bit more NFL news since the interview with Pete Hailey. Adrian Peterson has been released from the Washington football team, a move that shocked pretty much everybody. Had a chance to catch up with Pete more on this after our interview. I'm going to read off what he said. He really surprised me, wouldn't have surprised me in April if they did it after signing J.T. McKissick and drafting Antonio Gibson. Once they got to camp and used him so much early, I thought he was on the roster for sure. In my opinion, the only back for the Washington football team that has any sort of experience in the NFL is J.D. McKissick. So to release Adrian Peterson, there are one of two things that come to my mind. Number one, Washington wants a younger franchise. They're moving on from Adrian Peterson. Not saying because he's old and washed up. It's clear that Adrian Peterson wants to continue to play. But the situation is, did Washington want to keep Adrian Peterson or release him? They obviously released him. I mean, it's really hard to tell, but in my opinion, I feel like they just wanted younger talent on that squad, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me because of the fact that there's only one guy with NFL experience on the depth chart under the running back position. So it's going to be interesting to see how Coach Rivera and the offensive coaching staff works around that situation going into the season. So keep an eye on that. But on the other hand, Adrian Peterson has announced he still wants to play in the Detroit Lions. Sign him to a 1-year, $1.5 million contract to play with the Detroit Lions in the division with the Minnesota Vikings, where he spent most of his career. And I think what's good about this move for AP is he gets another opportunity to get closer and closer to breaking Emmitt Smith's all-time rushing record. It's clear to Adrian Peterson that that's what he wants. The all-time rushing record broken. So if that happens, he still has juice left in the tank. He still has gas left in the tank, folks. Excuse me. But if he can get it done, he's no doubt a Hall of Famer. That's just one more thing to add to the resume, breaking Emmitt Smith's record. So all the best to Adrian Peterson. He did great things in Washington. I really enjoyed watching him play. And it was just an honor getting to see a veteran join this Washington football club to try to make a difference. So other than that, Adrian Peterson with the Lions, hoping all the best for him moving forward in whatever he does. And heck, I wouldn't mind to see Adrian Peterson break Emmitt Smith's record. That would be really huge. I would really love to see that. Other news in the NFL, Jadeveon Clowney signs a 1-year, $15 million deal to go to the Tennessee Titans. I think that's going to help the Titans defense a lot. They went on a big run to the Super Bowl last season, did not make it all the way, but it was great to see how well the Titans have improved from years past. But it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. You know, head coach Mike Vrabel is more of a defensive-minded coach. So I feel like that's one piece of the puzzle that they have to add depth to their defense and make the Titans an even better team than what they were last year. All right, so coming up next, we're gonna make a little twist on the podcast. My interview with sports director over at WDVM in Hagerstown, Maryland, Allif Karim, on the status of the playing of high school football amidst COVID and everything. What the status of the states in the high school leagues have decided on if they're playing or not. Coming up next, Allif Karim. Now joining us on the Kirby on Sports podcast, the sports director of WDVM based in Hagerstown, Maryland, Allif Karim. Allif, thanks so much for joining us. It must be challenging doing what you are doing during these challenging times. I know COVID has sort of simmered down a little bit, but still, how have you been handling things over there at WDVM in your capacities as sports director, and has things been different with COVID so far?
Well, hey, Jeff, thanks for having me on your show, man. You do great work, bro. And I still remember that first time we met at Sharando High School. I think it was for a Martinsburg game.
Yes, it was.
That was a lot of fun. Well, the game wasn't that fun for Sharando, but it was a great memory. But no, I mean, great question, man. You know, with sports and COVID, what I like telling people sometimes is sports hasn't stopped. Like, there have been no games on schedule, and that's understandable. You know, there are no games scheduled ahead for some states, and that's also understandable. But just because there are no games, just because there are no events, doesn't mean sports has stopped. It just means our storytelling has to be a little bit different. And different is okay. For me, different has been reaching out to athletes and coaches that maybe have started initiatives on their own to either take charge of their health, take charge of things happening in their communities, or even just conversations about things they've been trying and, you know, how things have been different during COVID. The virus obviously is still affecting our nation, and the pandemic is still affecting sports to this day, but that still doesn't change what we do primarily as journalists, which is to keep people informed about what's happening in their communities and to keep everyone in the loop about stories that they should know about.
So WDVM is sort of a local station, but you have done national events like Washington football team games and Maryland basketball and stuff like that. But I want to start locally to begin with. High school football, you cover the district, Maryland and Virginia. Maryland and Virginia have elected to reconvene in the spring to see if they can play football, but West Virginia is hitting the ground running. What's sort of the reason West Virginia decided to resume football on a normal schedule, and do you think that could change if the pandemic gets worse?
Certainly. So I definitely think the pandemic is going to be something to consider. Hopefully not into the next year, but certainly up until the end of this year. But my understanding is that West Virginia as a state is comfortable moving forward because West Virginia, in terms of density, is just not that populated. When we cover the Eastern Panhandle, those are not areas where generally you would find a lot of people with the issue of social distancing. As a coach told me, it's a pretty socially distant state in itself. So that being said, of course, when you come down to football or even any sport, for the matter of fact, in fall season, you know, people are going to be near each other and people are going to be breathing on each other and just overall around each other a lot more than maybe just outside their normal social bubble. I think West Virginia has a lot of confidence because the state itself is taking very common sense measures very seriously. And really, it all just comes down to making sure your hands are clean and just wearing a mask and being aware of the space you have between people. I spoke with a couple of athletic directors recently in terms of being able to cover their fall season sports. And they basically told me that as long as you're smart and safe, you can cover our sports. And that's generally what West Virginia has done to get to the point where, their COVID numbers in terms of cases and deaths proportionally are not as high as obviously the district and Maryland and Virginia as well, because a lot of Virginia and Maryland are, they're taking their numbers, and the concentration of where we cover them are in pretty densely populated areas.
Yes, very great point there. So high school football, it's probably just going to be West Virginia for the time being. Sticking locally, Martinsburg High School with a brand new head coach after Dave Walker leaves to go to Concord University to coach their college football team. What are your thoughts on the new head coach hire, and how will Martinsburg still be a powerhouse in the Eastern Panhandle?
Look, so this is obviously a topic that I'm sure a lot of people have discussed as well. And to kind of give my thoughts on it, what Coach Walker did with Martinsburg that's just never going to be repeated elsewhere. He's the winningest head coach there. He coincidentally has 304 wins, and the state area code is 304. But Coach Walker has not just won a lot as a coach, but he's given so much to his community. And the new head coach, Mr. Britt Sherman, he understands that he's not going to be a Dave Walker. And the great part about him is he doesn't want to be another Dave Walker. He was in the Dave Walker system, but that wasn't necessarily just exclusive for Mr. Walker or Coach Walker. That was the Martinsburg system. And the Martinsburg system has simply been to make sure that the boys in those communities have something to fall back on, have something to rest their heads on, have something to lean on. And that's the football program, which not only helps the kids, but helps the community come together Friday nights. And so it's really awesome that the team can have football games this fall when the whole nation is struggling to put together their local athletics. Just in terms of what I think about the new coach, I've met with the man 2 to 3 times at this point. He's a great guy. He's very responsive to DVM requests and calls, and he understands that us as media have a job to do, and he's very helpful in terms of helping us do that job. But as a coach, from a coaching standpoint, I've noticed him in practice, and he's very understanding of his players. He understands that, what happened previously under Coach Walker may not be repeated, and that's okay, because that pressure shouldn't be on him and shouldn't be on the players either to continue doing what they were doing. And what they were doing was flat out dominating. Now, this is not me saying they're not going to dominate anymore. I still think Martinsburg is a very clear favorite in the AAA class to be able to go all the way to the state finals and win it. They just have the talent, and I think that talent will continue still just because of the pipeline they have on the I-81 highway. Just access through that feeds in a bunch of talent from, specifically I'm thinking the Baltimore area or the greater DMV in general. And I think because that pipeline's still open for them, good or bad, at the very least for local athletics, it is still going to give them space to have great athletes come into that area. And I mean, the Martinsburg name is legendary. So I know a lot of kids will want to still play for that team however they can. And I'm pretty confident that the talent, while it may seem like it's depleted, it really isn't. It's just new names and faces, and new names and faces will all come to love and hear from a lot in terms of local highlights.
Absolutely. Great point there. So, Allif, other interesting stories have you been able to catch up with other coaches, players from other high schools around the area in Maryland or Virginia during this sort of dead time where they're not preparing for a season right away?
Yeah, definitely. So actually, it's funny that we're talking about local stories, because when the pandemic first hit, I wasn't doing sports anymore. I was primarily in the news department. I was actually filling in as one of the local news anchors before we just hired a true news anchor, Joseph Olmo, who just started, I would say recently, but it's been almost 3 months now. So I was on the news side, and I wasn't really doing a lot of sports coverage. But one of the first few stories I got to do was to be able to, have the introductory piece on Coach Rich Sherman. And there were a bunch of other pieces that I did. I just can't recall them right now, but I was really not involved in the sports side of things during the initial stages of the pandemic. And then later, of course, I got the chance to come back, and by blessed means, I got the promotion to sports director.
So how's that been going, sports director? What have you been doing? Like, you manage a whole department. How does that differ from being just a regular sports anchor?
Certainly. So I guess the biggest difference, it comes down to what we call in local news being an executive producer, which basically that's the person that deals with scheduling in terms of keeping track of things and where they're happening and where they are, and delegating in terms of where someone should go or not. So in a sense, my job is a little bit easier right now because of this pandemic. And there's not a lot for me to juggle, because whether it's some states are postponed and some aren't, and some programs are happening and some aren't. So in general, it's pretty easy for me to be able to do what I'm doing right now, or what I'm supposed to be doing. That being said, like you had mentioned, it's a full sports department. We're actually going to hire one more person recently for our Montgomery County spot, which we've never done before, Montgomery County, Maryland. But outside of that, for me, it's just a matter of making sure that the people that I'm working with just know that they're not working under me, they're working with me. And for me, it's just, I want them to feel as comfortable as possible and be able to grow as much as possible. And wherever their life takes them from that point on, takes them in that direction.
Yeah, that is a great point to throw out there. So, as sports director, do you sort of dictate or say how far you're willing to travel to cover a certain area, or is your area pretty much set already? And can you tell us what WDVM's area is in terms of sports?
Certainly. So that's the best question that we've had for DVM in a while, only because DVM's sports coverage zone has often changed very recently. I know myself personally, before I got sports director even, I was doing a lot of University of Maryland coverage. That's just because I enjoyed doing it, and I wanted to keep enjoying that, and I wanted to keep expanding that. So yeah, in a sense, with being sports director, I do have a say in terms of which direction we can go and what areas we can start covering. And of course, with that comes the obvious drawback that because we cover more in one place, we have to cover less in the other. So that the toughest part about the job is, of course, juggling our area and juggling our audience in terms of where we're going to get our clicks and shares from. My personal opinion is, for me, it's let's do the best local content we can, localize as much as we can, and make sure that we're putting out the best type quality that we can out there, even if it means that sometimes maybe our national coverage doesn't look as good. And that's okay, because at DVM, we're generally all a younger bunch, and it's okay to make mistakes when you're young. And I try to remind myself of that sometimes too, when I'm trying to maybe push the bar a little too hard, a little too quickly.
Absolutely there. So, yeah, moving on to some national coverage, I just sort of want to get your thoughts, Allif, on in your terms, how do you like the formats of the playoff bubbles in the NBA and NHL? And obviously they're succeeding. Do you like that idea? What did you think when they announced they were going to do bubble formats?
So I remember when they first announced the NBA bubble, at first I was a little skeptical about it, not just because of the idea of a bubble with COVID, but because at that point as well in the country, there were so many social changes happening in terms of protests that have happened because of George Floyd's death. And for me, being aware of all the social change, there was a side of me that was against these playoff formats and thought that maybe now wouldn't be the best time to have sports, because sports would take the conversation away from what matters more. But with that being said, once the bubble started playing through, especially with the NBA and the NHL, I was very pleased, very surprised, and very happy with how things have been going so far. The NBA bubble and the NHL bubble kind of proved the point that in isolation, sports can work. If you just bubble these players in for 2 to 3 months and have them play out their playoffs, it can work. Obviously, we're seeing it right now with the NHL, with the NBA. Of course, you talk about the strikes that have happened with the players because of Jacob Blake's death. But outside of that, prior to, they were working very well. There were no positive cases within the bubble for weeks. And I thought sports as a whole can happen if you can bubble them. But then you obviously run into the issue the MLB did, because the MLB had to factor in travel, and they had to factor in kind of moving in different places for creating an operation. And the problem is because you allowed for movement, you allowed for travel, you allowed for space outside of your little bubble or your area, then you obviously run the risk of a positive test here and a positive test there. Of course, we remember there was a whole weekend that was basically postponed. And that's sort of the situation that I had a feeling baseball was going to run into, because just sheer numbers-wise, baseball has so many people in terms of personnel, whether it's players, coaches, PR staff, team staff, stadium staff, and of course traveling media that might want to join as well. So that was an issue. And then you can say the same thing for football as well, because football will still allow for travel, and football will also allow for, movement outside of their own personal bubbles. I think right now you're not hearing so much because with the NFL, they are in their own training camp bubbles right now. But I like to think that, I think that once you introduce travel for games in the regular season, then you might see a couple of spikes in cases here and there. And at that point, it's a matter of, do you want to risk players' health versus making that money? And that's a conversation that is way above my head.
Yeah, I completely understand that. So, Allif, you had the opportunity to interview Washington football team's VP of digital communications, essentially part of the broadcast team. Tell us a little bit about your interview with her and how you feel the direction of the Washington football team is going. Do you think they're going in the right direction for a positive future? What were your takeaways from that?
Certainly. So Miss Julie Donaldson was an absolute joy to interview, and you could really see through the interview as well that I had with her and her answers that the experience that she has shows, right? She has 10 plus years of experience at an extremely high level of broadcasting, whether it's through local television or a regional network. And that shows on who she is, but what shows even more, and what I think she's trying to show as well, and I believe she is very well, is the sort of character that she has, which she truly cares about wanting the team culture to be better. I mean, this is a person who was a journalist for the team for 10 years, and now she has an opportunity to lead and trailblaze a way that has never been done before as part of a radio broadcast booth, being the first woman in that role to be that high, the first woman in the NFL radio broadcast booth. And I think she's doing a fantastic job. Speaking with her, she spoke about the pressure of the job, and for her, she just wants to do a good job. And whether there is pressure or not, and of course there is, and she realizes that, but however she feels it, at the end of the day, she's just trying to do a good job. And I think personally, she's doing great so far. She's already introduced so many new facets to the radio broadcast and to just media consumption for the Washington football team that has never been done before. And it's very refreshing because it sounds and it looks, when you look at the social media posts, when you look at, the live coverage that they have from their training camp right now, it all seems routine. But because I've seen what it looked like before Julie Donaldson, and because I see what it looks like now with her in charge, it just feels and sounds and looks refreshing compared to what it was. And I think that's really what the Washington football team as a whole wanted. And I think they got their girl in Julie, and they are running with it. She's running with it. And I can really see a very positive future for just broadcast in general for the entire Washington football franchise.
Appreciate the insight there, Allif. So, really quick before we wrap things up here, it's not my type of podcast unless I ask you this. When did you decide you wanted to get into sports, and what led you to get to where you are today?
Yeah. So, wow, that's a great question. You're making me go back in time a little bit. So basically, I didn't know I wanted to be in broadcasting until my orientation of college. And mind you, this is a college I picked not knowing what the campus looked like at all. I just picked it because it was the cheapest place to go to. And I originally was going to go to college for electrical engineering. So when I got to orientation and I started meeting all these kids and I saw the campus and I was enthralled, I was like, wow, this is great. So also context, I went to college in SUNY Oswego, State University of New York at Oswego. It's a small state school, just an hour above Syracuse, New York, in case anyone was wondering. But to kind of go back to the story, when I was there and I was enthralled by everything that I was seeing at orientation, and I met this person, her name's Crystal Cole, and she kind of introduced me to everything broadcasting. And through my own research, through my own motivations, I kind of determined during my first week of actual class that I wanted to get into broadcasting. And so I kind of switched my major, not even knowing what local TV was, what the difference was between local TV and regional networks, what the difference was between local TV and competing markets and dealing with print and radio as well. So I had no clue. I just picked broadcasting because I thought it sounded cool and I was goodish public speaker, so why not try it? And so as I kind of got into broadcasting and got into my local, college TV station, I started really falling in love with the process involved in creating content and telling stories, editing, scripting, using nat sounds, interviewing people, all of it. I just fell in love with that whole process. And there was no one specific part of the process I enjoy more than the other. I just enjoy everything about it. And kind of my junior year in college, that's when I determined, you know what, I want to take this the sports route. And I remember being in college and around all these bros that they know their stuff. They know what they're talking about. They know the history of the teams they like. And me, I wasn't really a fan of any local team. I mean, my family lives in Philadelphia now. So I kind of said, okay, I'm a Philly sports guy, but I'm not really a Philly sports guy. I just choose to support them because they're the teams closest to where my family is. And so for me, you can tell my friends or ask them and, they'll tell you about nights I would be up just on Wikipedia or on the internet, just browsing article after article by any writer about the Philadelphia teams, about other teams in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and just learn as much as I can about each sport. And, I went from being someone in my college that no one would have looked at me and said, hey, like, this guy's definitely going to get a sports job, right? No one thought that. But my senior year comes around and I'm lucky enough to be able to say I'm one of the few people that actually got a sports job. And so for me to kind of ask the broad question or answer it, I picked sports broadcasting not because of sports. Obviously that did play a factor in it, but the main factor was what kind of storytelling could I do through sports? And for me, it came from my love of watching sports documentaries, 30 for 30s. I've watched Winning Time with Reggie Miller hundreds of times, because that was the first documentary I ever watched that kind of made me fall in love with sports storytelling. And that sort of led me into the decision to want to go into sports broadcasting, local sports TV, and, well, hey, I'm just trying to tell good stories now.
That is really cool to hear, that it's not all about the sports, but it's about the stories you can tell in sports. So that is really cool to me. I remember you were telling me earlier before we got on the interview that you enjoy listening to podcasts because it's a lot of great sports stories. And that's what I love. And you're doing what you do best over there at WDVM. Once again, that's Allif Karim. You can find him on Twitter at Allif Karim. He's doing great things over there on WDVM. Allif, keep up the great work, man. Thanks so much for hopping on with us.
Hey, man, thank you so much. I appreciate this. Appreciate your time as well, and appreciate what you're doing as well, man. You know, you're still finding ways to tell stories, to talk to people during a pandemic, and right now, I mean, a lot of people, even though you might not hear it, love hearing your voice, and I mean, I did too. So I just hope this podcast episode is as good as the others.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, man. All the support, greatly appreciated, man. The Kirby on Sports podcast will continue right after this.
Hey guys, this is Jason Kamlowski of FantasyPros.com, back for another season of Fantasy Football Files with the Kirby on Sports podcast, bringing you guys start sits, DFS advice, and all kinds of fantasy goodness. Looking forward to joining Josh on the pod. Looking forward to having some NFL this year. It's going to be a great season. A lot of fantasy goodness coming at you. You can catch my weekly handcuff article exclusively on fantasypros.com, so go check that out. And you can follow me on Twitter at Jason Kamlowski. That's at Jason, Kamlowsky, Kamlowski. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon.
Yes, indeed. That is right. Fantasy Football Files will be back on the Kirby on Sports podcast. We're so glad to have Jason Kamlowski back with us for another year of Fantasy Football Files. My beliefs are, if we have a great fantasy football insider giving you, the listeners, the advice you need in order to win your fantasy football leagues, we will have you covered. And Jason Kamlowski is the perfect guy to have you covered. So thank you once again to Jason Kamlowski and to Allif Karim of WDVM for coming on the show as well. All right, rounding out the show with final season, the NBA and NHL playoffs from their respective bubbles. Starting off in the NHL, we have gotten down to the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference Finals. Big story out of this one, Barry Trotz gets the New York Islanders to the Eastern Conference Finals. It was a series, a big series going to 7 games against Philadelphia the last series. It was huge, and there were some pivotal points, pivotal moments, and Barry Trotz knew how to lead his team to victory in 7 games to surpass the Philadelphia Flyers in order to move on to play the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Eastern Conference Finals. The game 1 in that just went final a few moments ago, the Tampa Bay Lightning routing the Islanders 8-2. But Barry Trotz, as you know, former Washington Capitals head coach, gets their team to the Stanley Cup, wins it all. The Washington Capitals, their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. Barry Trotz is the coach to do that. This just goes to show Barry Trotz leading the Islanders to success. The Capitals should have done more to keep Barry Trotz, and this is what they get. They end up firing Todd Reirden, and their former head coach, Barry Trotz, is in the Eastern Conference Finals once again. So that didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but it is what it is. I'm happy for Barry Trotz. No harsh feelings, no disregard for what he has done for Washington. I am happy to see he is in the Eastern Conference Finals with the New York Islanders. The Vegas Golden Knights are back in the West Conference Finals for the first time since their opening year in 2018 when they went on to face the Washington Capitals in the 2018 Stanley Cup Final. They're facing the electric Dallas Stars. That's set to be a good one as well. Moving on to the NBA, we are in the second round action games. It is so far the Los Angeles Clippers against the Denver Nuggets, the Boston Celtics against the Toronto Raptors. That is the East second round, and the Clippers against the Nuggets are in the West. Boston and Toronto have been necking it out neck and neck all day. The East second round, the Miami Heat in the Milwaukee Bucks. This is a game we have to talk about, folks, because the Miami Heat, they're a number 5 seed and Milwaukee's a number 1 seed. Milwaukee's down 1-3 in the series. You heard me correctly, 1-3 in the series. Miami has shown up. It's been crazy. And to see Miami dominating this series, they almost had the Bucks in elimination, but the Bucks won in overtime. So that's going to be interesting to see if a number 1 seed in the bubble gets knocked out by the number 5 seed in the Miami Heat. Other side of the West, the Los Angeles Lakers against the Houston Rockets tied in that series at 1 apiece. So a lot of exciting news. The Clippers and the Nuggets, I forgot to mention, they are both tied at 1 in the series as well. So a lot to look forward to, a lot of finals action to be played, and I'm looking forward to having a lot more sports to cover. The NFL, as you know, kickoff is right around the corner. The Kirby on Sports podcast and myself, I cannot wait. I cannot wait. I've been waiting for the NFL to come back. But like I said before, I'm going to have to see it in order for myself to believe it. So if that happens, I can't wait. Before we round out the show, I just want to thank each and every one of my supporters for the journey, the great journey. We're 2 years strong here on the Kirby on Sports podcast. I can't thank the listeners and my supporters enough for everything you've done throughout the way. I will continue to bring the best content we have, sports through our perspective. I can't wait for this football season. I'm sure all of you cannot wait either. So stick with us here on the Kirby on Sports podcast. As always, you can check out the Kirby on Sports podcast on literally any streaming platform. Save it for your commute to work in the morning or in the evening if you want, but we're here for you 24/7 on all streaming platforms. As always, big thanks to Dave Johnson, MPT Now Productions, and Productions by Q for everything they've done for this podcast as well. We're sponsored by Regroup Building Services and PM Plus Reserves. Until the next episode, make sure you continue to create greatness, and we'll see you next time.